Our next one is 471. 471. Is it the crowning day? Would you like to pray over the offering for us, please? stand for this one, please. 379. 379. $379. We have an anchor.
All right, Mad's got the prayer cards this evening. Of course, be in prayer for Sunday. The women will be with us this week, and then the men will be with us the week after. So looking forward to having them as our guests. It's also a great opportunity to invite other people, invite family and friends and co-workers or relatives or whoever. It's a great chance to bring them along because the preaching is just going to be simple, both this week and next week. Just simple gospel. That's what we've learned with Shalom: is don't overcomplicate it. Just keep it simple, and we're going to do that on Sunday and the next 2 weeks. Simple gospel messages. The singing's going to be good. Probably trust the choir and the ladies are ready to go, and it'll be good. So bring someone along. Invite someone to come along to the house of God this weekend, and next weekend. It'll be great times to have guests. Any prayer requests this evening? So Shalom. Rhiannon.
Pray for me because I've started homeschooling and I need much wisdom.
Yeah, Rhiannon's homeschooling, so.
Also, does somebody want to pray about doing the calendar?
Yeah, I'll mention that. But,
Okay.
Yep. Jesse.
Just about Wendy. Remember to pray for Wendy.
Yep.
And a praise point more than a prayer. My teacher assistant is a pastor's wife. So it's very nice to work in that environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. Jeff.
I just wanted to ask for prayer for my auntie who's going in for major surgery in a couple of weeks for some cancer. It's going to take like a year to recover, so just like to ask for prayer.
Yeah, for sure. So,
Lynn.
anybody else? Julie.
Work.
Work.
Work
Yeah.
for everybody who needs it.
Yep. There are a few that need it, for sure. Do pray one for another in that regard.
Yeah, just pray for the services at the weekend. Yeah, looking forward to it. But yeah, just for the gospel, like what you were saying. I'm pretty much repeating everything you're saying. But I was just thinking, like even myself and for us, like as church members as well. Afterwards, the opportunities that you get after the preaching are like really important. And I realized that when, you know, the first time they came and everybody was just around talking to people, and it's fantastic. Like, but I realized talking to men out there, you sort of think, because they're real pumped and they're like, yeah, you know, and real like this is great and praise the Lord. You kind of think, oh, they're all Christians or all these lads are Christians, but a lot of them don't actually really understand how simple the gospel is. Like that, you know, you put your faith in Jesus, you become born again. It's a one-time thing, and then, you know, baptism and all that sort of stuff comes afterwards. So just pray for all of us that we get good opportunities and take the opportunities to you know, witness to people and talk to people about Jesus and about the gospel afterwards. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, before, show yourself friendly. That's the thing that I love about Shalom Sundays. Is an opportunity for the whole entire church to minister on that day. So there'll absolutely be people here you don't know, and they don't know you, but you're familiar here. So you go up to them and welcome them, learn their name, even if it's just one or two people. Just make an effort, go out of your comfort zone, and just say hi to someone, and they'll be sitting down here waiting. So absolutely, and then afterwards, absolutely true. Not everyone that comes in are Christians. Some are, some aren't. So great opportunities to just talk with them and challenge them about their faith with the gospel. So for sure, great opportunities this week.
Just for my mum and dad as well. They're looking at visa options as well for getting in permanently, and just spoke to a migration agent today and just looking at different options. It's unfortunately it's a long road no matter what way you come onto it. But just pray that God would give wisdom and make the process go as smoothly and quickly as possible. So
For sure.
I appreciate prayer for that.
Yep. Love to have them back as soon as possible, for sure. Any other prayer requests this evening? Down the front.
Just pray for a workmate of mine, Johan. It's, I can't pronounce his last name, but he come along to the men's prayer group up there for the second time. He's been really enjoying that. I just really need prayer for him.
Pray for Johan. If you know, I can hear it at the front, but sometimes you can't hear it at the back. Cole, is there a way of turning the mics on? And no, these speakers here.
Yeah, it's always
Okay.
Maybe I'll just hold it close.
I'm afraid to talk now. Amelia.
Just pray for Jade. She
Yeah.
had a car accident on Friday, I think it was, for drink driving, but it was caused because she was drink driving. And thankfully, she wasn't injured and no one else was or anything like that. And thankfully, her daughter was in the car with her. But she says that she's learned a lesson. She's not going to do it again. But just pray that God will use this to just get her attention and snap her out of what she's currently
Yeah,
doing.
for sure.
And, so just pray for Jade.
For those who know Jade, rode her car off, and pray for Jade. For those that know her, for sure. Any other prayer requests this evening?
The Busters up there, I was just seeing the news tonight where they've only just gone through the tsunami and all that ramifications, but now they're in the total lockdown because they've had some COVID cases obviously come through. I don't know, but so that's probably going to put a lot of extra pressure on. They were talking how the shops don't normally open till 9. People were lining up from 7 o'clock in the morning trying to get food, do preparation for the lockdown.
And island time, no one's ever early. So that's that's the equivalent of waking up at like 5 o'clock.
Yeah, so with the Busters, that's what they must be going through.
Yeah. Do continue to pray for the Busters. There's lots of clean-up over there. Where was another hand? Oliver.
The lost jobs and the Dentfords.
Yes, the lost jobs, work as well, as we prayed for before, but for sure.
Just remember to pray for our leaders.
Yep.
Those in government and that.
Yep, pray for our leaders. That's a command in scriptures to do so. Pray that they stop making knucklehead decisions. That's it. Robin.
Just wanted to pray for people that are trying to access information and services, and because they're vaccine free, they're not allowed to enter venues. I've tried to access information to help my mum this week, and I've not been allowed to enter these places. And I do have some other options, but it was really heartbreaking to be told that. So just for everybody else anywhere that has that happen, that they have other options.
For sure. It's a tricky time all the way around. I think goes back to what Kimmy said. Pray for our leaders. They stop making knucklehead decisions. Cal.
We've been bombarded with COVID, but also around the world at the moment, there's a lot of natural disasters happening that we're not seeing on the news. Good opportunity for us to pray for our world and pray that people get saved out of natural disasters. And you can get on any day of the week, 5, 6, 7, which are not on the news. Even in Australia, right through to South Australia, we completely wiped out through floods.
Yeah.
That's going to affect us directly.
Yeah. I find it very interesting. Well, just being reminded of how fragile life actually is. Everything's fine and everything's running smoothly until it doesn't run smoothly, and then you realise, oh, actually, I can't go to Coles or I can't do this, and this is just, there's things prophesied that'll get worse. But you can see how fragile it is. It really is a house of cards. The whole world is a house of cards. And God knows what to do to get man's attention. Any other prayer requests tonight? Connor.
Boy that we know, his name's Isaac. I mentioned like a few months ago that I witnessed to him, and he said he was going to come to church, but never happened. But I witnessed to him a few times. But anyway, long story short, he's now in prison, and he's looking at a bit of time or whatever. So he requested that I come in and chat with him, but I can't because I'm not vaxxed or whatever. So I need to go down to the prison and sign up to put my number down, so that he can approve it, and then he can call me. So I was talking to his girlfriend yesterday, and she was saying that he really does want me to do that, so that he can call me and have chats or whatever. And just pray for that I can just witness to him, and just really say the right words to allow God to open his eyes and open his heart to the sin-filled life he's living, and he needs Jesus.
Yeah, for sure. Charles is a great testimony of someone that went through jail to find Jesus.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
And that was a great testimony on Monday night actually, about Charles. They said that the Catholic priest was there, and Charles was the one who invited him, because he knew Charles when he was on the streets, before he was in jail, before he got saved, and then he's seen Charles, and still sees him around, and seen the massive change in Charles's life, and Charles invited him, came along on Monday night. So, and then Ben preached on. I wasn't in there; I was on the door, but I think Ben preached on "You must be born again." Very un-Catholic sermon. You won't hear that in Mass. So, very good. Richard is his name, if you remember Richard in prayer. Any last prayer requests? Oliver, just call it out so it saves his legs.
The unsaved?
Yes. Do pray for them for sure, and particularly this Sunday, hopefully, Lord willing, that they'll come to trust Christ this week. That would be wonderful. The book of Daniel. What we're going to do through this is, as we get to the beginning of a new book, we'll do an overview night, and then an overview of the book, and then the next week we'll start on the chapters. Now, some of the minor prophets have one chapter, and some have 12 and 14. But Daniel sort of falls. Some people classify it as a major prophet, some classify it as a minor prophet. And you might be sitting there thinking, what's the difference between a major prophet and a minor prophet? Nothing, really. It's just someone coined the phrase major prophet, meaning the larger books, so like Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and then the minor prophets, because they're shorter in their message and what's contained for us. But it's not necessarily that there's a major message and a minor message. It's just really just the size of the books. If you were to pick up the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, or however it's pronounced, their book is broken down into, their Old Testament is broken down into 3 sections: the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the 5 first books there of Moses. Then it's something else, history. I want to say poetry, but no, it's not poetry, it's history. And then prophets. So they have 3 sections. And the Tanakh, which they know it for, it comes from the beginning letters of the Hebrew words of what that's called, Torah, which is where the beginning of the Tanakh starts with. So it's slightly, we have in our Bible a different layout of the books than what they would have. So the major and minor prophets, it's not really, we say minor prophets, but there's not really any reason why, apart from their size. And then where does Daniel fit? Is he in the major or is he in the minor? He's right here. I would say Daniel, though, if you're taking messages and importance and use throughout scriptures, Daniel has a very major part to play. And that's why we started with Daniel in this, because a lot of the prophecies that we'll come to, Daniel will lay a very good foundation for this. Now, I don't know A lot of times people shy away from these books because they seem to be heavy, but there's good things, and you'll find that there's nuggets as we go through, and some weeks might be a bit like a Job, where some might go down into some deep stuff that we're not really getting our heads around quite, and we sort of come out the other side thinking, you know what, I don't think we fully got that one, and that's might be an opportunity to go back. But at least this is my goal, just to do a chapter by chapter, so that you sort of at the very least, have an understanding. I might be able to turn down now if you want to. So you at least have an understanding, an overview of sorts about these books. Daniel chapter number 1 and verse number 1, and we're only going to read 2 verses. We're not going to go very far into Daniel at all. Now I'm not going to take the feedback on the overview sessions or these sermons here, but next week when we go to chapter by chapter, then we'll read ahead, study it up, and come back with some feedback. So next week we're going to take feedback like we normally would on a Wednesday night, but these overviews, we'll just do an overview for you this evening. I was thinking today, and it's a bit late to do it, but to put a piece of paper that outlines this, but it should be good to follow along here. It says, verse 1 says this, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God." It's the very beginning of when Nebuchadnezzar came, the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and the 3rd year of Jehoiakim. Nebuchadnezzar comes along and wages war against Jerusalem. Now, we've mentioned this before going through the book of Jeremiah, but 3 times Nebuchadnezzar comes back. He comes here in the 3rd reign of Jehoiakim, and up until this point they were paying tribute to Egypt. Now Nebuchadnezzar comes along, and basically the power shifts, and Nebuchadnezzar overtakes Egypt and Israel and takes Jerusalem, and now they are paying tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. At this very early stage, very little sort of takes place, and this is the beginning of the captivity. But very little, it's not really a seismic shift like you will find. Nebuchadnezzar comes along, he defeats them, and Jehoiakim now pays tribute and is now paying money, paying taxes there to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is ruler, and he goes back to Babylon, but he takes with him some of the treasures out of the house of God, and he also takes away, we learn at the end of the book of Kings and Chronicles, he also takes away some of the princes and some of the best young men that the nation of Israel has, and he does it deliberately so that they can become ambassadors and they can become leader, or they become part of the multicultural cabinet of sorts there in Babylon, so that now as Nebuchadnezzar is ruling and reigning over vast empire with multiple nations and multiple languages, he wants certain young men that he can raise up, he can train up, that can speak their language, and then will be taught the tongue of the Chaldeans so they speak their language, and he now has at his disposal good men that will help him to rule and reign over this multinational empire that is set up. And out of that, there are 2 men that come. Verse 3 says, "And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, of the king's seed, and of the princes." I mean, these are high quality individuals. He's not just taking them from off the streets, from lying in the gutter. They are of the king's seed, and they are princes. They are children in whom was no blemish, but they were well favored. They were skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had the ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning of the tongue of the Chaldeans. So that's who's taken. And out of that very early, very beginning taking away into Babylon, Daniel is taken. He's one of the very first to go into captivity. It's another 11 years later, I think, that Nebuchadnezzar comes back and takes more into captivity. That's where Ezekiel is taken into captivity. 11 years later, But at this particular time, Daniel is taken, probably as a very young man, maybe 12, 13, 14, just as a young teenager, it would seem. A very young man. He's known Josiah, the godly king. He knows Jeremiah, the prophet who's been prophesying at this particular time. And he's taken away from that, and he is now removed into Babylon. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions as an overview. The who, you can study that as I read, and we'll come to that in just a minute. But just the who, the where, the when, the why, and the what of the book of Daniel is that who wrote the book of Daniel? Daniel. Now, Daniel wrote it, we would say that. What's interesting is that Ezekiel mentions him. Ezekiel mentions him, and Ezekiel is a contemporary with Daniel. In chapter 14 and verse 14 of Ezekiel, it says, though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, meaning in the nation of Israel, they should deliver but their own souls by their righteousness, saith the Lord God. So Daniel is spoken about very highly by Ezekiel in the same caliber as Noah and Job. Now Noah is long dead. His testimony is sealed. Once a person dies, more than likely, very rarely does people's opinion of a person change afterwards. He's locked in to what he's done in his life, and Noah is locked in. Job locked in. These are godly men who have had faithful witness all the way to their death. And Daniel is mentioned amongst these men, though Daniel at this particular stage of his life is not very old. He's only maybe even halfway through his life. He lives a very long life, maybe 80, 90 years of age, maybe even pushing 100. He went through the entire captivity. He was alive for the entire captivity. And so he was 80 when Cyrus took over at the very end. But he's mentioned here with Daniel and with Job. And that if he was in the nation of Israel, if he was brought back, God is saying, a fantastic man of God, that even if he was here, his righteousness could not save the nation of Israel. You think, what is going on? What does he mean by that? Let me just explore that for just a moment. Do you remember when Lot went down into Sodom? And God was going to bring judgment upon the city of Sodom because of their sin. And not just homosexuality, that was just a part of it. And there was pride, and there was the fullness of bread and abundance of idleness that Ezekiel makes mention of. But he says this, God says, I'm going to bring judgment upon them. He goes, tells Abraham, and Abraham says, right, but God, if there's 100 people, if I can find 100 people in the city of Sodom that are all righteous, would you spare the city? And God says, yes. And then he says, okay, and Abraham thinking, right, I don't have 100, I probably can't find 100 people down there. And so he goes down and he starts bartering with God, 50, 40, 30, and then he gets down to 10, and God says, yes, 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 and down to 10, he says, yes. If you find 10 righteous people in that city, God says, I will spare that city. And the judgment of God will not come upon that city. That's interesting because now he's saying about the nation of Israel, there's just not enough righteous people in the nation to stop God's judgment. Now think about it like this. What was Lot's wife turned into when she left the city of Sodom? What is salt? It's a preserver. Righteousness is a preserver against God's judgment. And so we are supposed to remember Lot's wife when she turned around to look back, and he said, don't look back, she turned into a pillar of salt, that the salt was removed is what happens there. Lot is brought out and God's judgment comes. And he makes that same idea here, that if Noah and Daniel and Job were in the nation of Israel, he's saying even their righteousness and how much they fear God and serve God is not enough righteousness to spare the judgment of God. And basically got to the stage where there just wasn't much righteousness left. There were still godly people. And think about this, that when Daniel was taken, God brought judgment that ultimately Nebuchadnezzar comes and completely wipes out Jerusalem and the temple. And you must say, man, the whole place must be wicked. But that wasn't. There was Jeremiah's, and there was Ezekiel's, and there was a Shadrach and a Meshach and a Abednego, and there was Daniel. These men were all contemporaries at the same time. They all went through the captivity. They went through the judgment of God, but every single one of them were godly, God-fearing, highest caliber men that feared God and went through the judgment of God because they lived during that time. But God judged the nation of Israel, not just looking for one or two people that could spare it. And he was saying that there's just not enough righteousness no longer left in the nation of Israel for God to spare his judgment. Which if our Western society would actually pay attention, maybe we should be getting scared that the righteousness in our societies is actually dwindling. And righteous souls, men and women who fear God, is dwindling. And if we were to plead before God, God, don't bring judgment. If there's 100, if there's 50, or whatever percentage it might be that we might put on there, or that God puts on there, that righteousness stops the judgment of God. And if you want to stop the judgment of God, ultimately for all eternity, you need the righteousness of Christ. That'll stop the judgment of God. So Daniel wrote, Daniel's made mention of, and Daniel's the author here. Where and when is the book set? Now you read here in verse number 1, it says that in the Lord gave, verse 2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim of Judah into his hand and part of the vessels, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. Does anybody know where the land of Shinar is, or what's significant about the land of Shinar? It is the Tower of Babel. First mention of Genesis is they went down to the plain of Shinar, and that's where they built the Tower of Babel. That's where the name Babylon gets its name. It's in the same part of the world. In today's map, it's in Iraq. It's south of Baghdad, north of Baghdad. It's either south or north of Baghdad. And if it's not, it could be east or west. But I'm pretty sure it's south of Baghdad. And we can check that out later. But it's in that particular part of the world. I have a personal opinion that if you look at that part of the world today, it's like barren wilderness. And you think, well, who would ever live there? I don't think that's what it used to look like. There's a verse in Jeremiah that I find interesting. God says that he will dry up the waters of Babylon. That whole land, which was the Fertile Crescent, the Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, was fertile, and now there's just little pockets of it there. But once upon a time, it would seem that it was just a very fertile area to live, and those rivers of the Euphrates and the Tigris flowed through there and watered the land there. So they went to the land of Shinar. It's in Mesopotamia. It's where the Tower of Babel is. It's where Babylon gets its name. And then you also have Babylon itself in verse number 4. It says, the children in whom was no blemish, well favoured, skillful in wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding and science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace. Now Nebuchadnezzar was king in Babylon. So the setting of this, where does this take place? It actually takes place in Babylon. Ezekiel is different. Ezekiel takes place by the river Chebar. It looks Chebar, which is another area west of Babylon. But he actually takes place. Daniel is actually in Babylon, where the palace is, because he has been recruited, if that's the word, forcibly recruited into the government of the day, into Nebuchadnezzar's government. So he's there at Babylon. In chapter number 8 and verse number 2, it says this. This is Daniel speaking, and he said, I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. Does anybody know where Elam is in modern day? Who are the Elamites, or the area of the Elamites? Anybody know? I thought someone might have known the answer to that. Shushan. Does anybody know where Shushan is? Esther. And who was reigning when Esther was queen? The people group. The Persians. It's Persia. It's Elam. The Persians are the Iranians. It's east of Iraq. It's east over there of Babylon. So he was out in Shushan, in that area, which I think is east and down towards the Gulf, is where Shushan is. So this takes place in that particular area. That's where Daniel spent the vast majority of his life. From a 10 or 11 or 12-year-old boy, he lives in Babylon, and he travels probably on official business out there to Shushan. And you find about Daniel that he just rises in the ranks. In fact, he becomes there's 3 presidents out of all of Nebuchadnezzar's men that he has in his government. There's 3 presidents that are over all the princes and over all the rulers. Daniel rises to be one of those, and then he becomes chosen to be head over the other 2 presidents. So he is second in command to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if you're second in command to Nebuchadnezzar, do you think they in Jerusalem knew that the second in charge was a Jew? Yeah. Absolutely. You know of your day who is the king. They would know Nebuchadnezzar, and you'd know who the second in charge is. So they would have known. They would have known that, man, this Daniel who was taken away, isn't this amazing? Daniel who was taken away, they're thinking, is now worked his way up. God has so elevated him in captivity that he is second to Nebuchadnezzar. They knew it. In fact, Ezekiel mentions this in chapter number 28. He says, behold, talking about the king of Tyre and the judgment that's going to come on the king of Tyre, he says this, behold, thou art wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that they can hide from me. That was his elevated pride. But it is interesting that Ezekiel makes mention of Daniel, the wise Daniel, that everybody knew in the realm of Nebuchadnezzar. Everybody knew who Daniel was. He was a very famous individual of his day, and no doubt very highly respected amongst the Jews, whether they were in captivity at Kibar, whether they were in Babylon, or whether they were wherever they had been scattered around. People knew Daniel. Daniel was respected all the way around and known. When did this take place? When was the book of Daniel written? Now, what was that answer? Okay. I was W.A. Criswell, not just him, but a few others, but his title caught my attention. And one of his sermons was titled, Daniel in the Critic's Den. And what he meant by that is Daniel has come under heavy scrutinism by the scholars of the day that are discrediting the book of Daniel and are saying, a lot of them, if you read Wikipedia and other pages that might collect secular history, they will put Daniel and the writing of the book of Daniel and all that's contained in the book of Daniel to somewhere in the 2nd century BC, at around 160 BC. Now, Daniel lived in 588 is when I think so 600, so there's 400 years, over 450 years, they say it was written 400 years later. The reason why, there's a very clear reason, I think, why they separate, why such heavy criticism has come to Daniel about whether he wrote it and when he wrote it, is because of this. Daniel is very accurate when it comes to prophecy. He writes and he interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and he goes through, thou art the head, Nebuchadnezzar. And if you've read through Daniel, you'd have seen this if you read ahead to read the head. Is the head of Nebuchadnezzar, which is Babylon, which is the Chaldeans and the Babylonians, and then the Medes and the Persians, and down to the Greeks and down to the Romans. I mean, to fulfillment, even to the details about Antiochus Epiphanes and the details about them. Now, if you're a secular historian that wants to discredit the Bible, you'd have to say, well, he couldn't have possibly known those things, so therefore it must have been written in 160 to 165 AD around this particular time, because it's so accurate. That's the point. Now, that's why it comes under heavy criticism. But this is a book of prophecy, and it's not just that we speculate and it casts doubt over the book of Daniel. Jesus says about the destruction that's going to come into the temple, he calls Daniel the prophet. Jesus calls Daniel the prophet, not Daniel the historian or someone else, but Jesus recognized Daniel as a prophet that foretold things because God told him these things. So Daniel, we must hold that Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. That those visions and dreams that God gave him, God literally gave him those dreams and he wrote them down. And if those first part has been fulfilled, then the second part is going to be just as fulfilling and just as accurate as the first part was. So we have a very accurate look at the world that is going to come. Why is Daniel important? So I just sort of answered that question right then. It sets out the future for the nations of Israel. It sets out the future for the Gentile nations, and it lays a foundation for the prophecy in the New Testament. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. It tells you the history of what's going to happen with Israel. It tells you what God's going to do with the Gentile nations, and the culmination, it brings in Jesus Christ, and he rules and reigns. It's not just for his time. It tells us the future all the way to Jesus coming again and the kingdom that it will be set up. It lays a foundation for the prophecy in the New Testament, and Revelation lays it as well. And if you were to read it, the layout of the book of Daniel is very interesting. It's like the first 6 chapters are sequential of sorts, and then he has these visions that almost overlay the previous 6 chapters, and it's almost like a repeat of what just took place. There are some repeats there, and it's restated again in different ways. Some of it's written in Hebrew, some of it's written in Aramaic, and you'll find as well in Aramaic, and I don't know what the word is, there's a word they have for this, but the most important point that they're trying to make is put right in the middle. Remember Lamentations, where it has 22 verses, and then 22 verses and 22 verses, and then in the middle it has 66. And right in the very middle of the 66 is where that the mercies of God are new. It's like the most important bit amongst all of this destruction. The way it's written is put right in the middle as the central part of it, so it'd be elevated on both sides. This is the central point and the main point. Some of the things that are in Daniel's as well is written that same way. So from chapter number 2, chapter number 2 is about, see if you know what it is. I didn't write this down. The dream. The dream. Chapter number 3 is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Chapter number 4 is the yes. The Nebuchadnezzar's, and then Belshazzar. And then after Belshazzar, the next chapter is Daniel in the lion's den. And then the chapter after Daniel in the lion's den is the vision of the 5 nations, of 4 nations and a 5th, which is what Nebuchadnezzar's dream is about. It's the head and the silver and the bronze. So you have this culmination that in the middle of it is that same point where on either side it's the vision, Nebuchadnezzar's dream image, and then he has his vision about the 4 nations and the 5th that comes along stronger. And then, what did I say? The boys in the furnace, and then Daniel in the lion's den. And then in the middle of those two, you have Nebuchadnezzar, God judging Nebuchadnezzar for his pride, and Belshazzar being judged. Is that ultimately God rules in the kingdom of men. That's the point that's being elevated there. And in fact, what is the big idea out of the book of Daniel? I would say that is the big idea. What's the key verse? Chapter 4 and verse 17 says this: "This matter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men." God in heaven rules in the kingdom of men. That's what Daniel is about. That it doesn't matter who sets themselves up. Nebuchadnezzar set himself up, and he says, "I've got here by my own abilities and my own powers." And God says, "Well, I'm going to cut you down like a tree. And your pride is going to be cut down. You're going to learn that you're only king because I allow you to be king. And no matter how high an earthly king gets himself amongst the nations, God says, right, but you're only doing my bidding, and I will ultimately judge the kings of the earth who set themselves up in pride and in opposition to me." And Daniel deals with all the nations, all the Gentile nations, and all Israel and the Gentile nations, and God will judge. And God rules, the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. That's sort of in a very nutshell what the book of Daniel is about. God rules. God is still on the throne all the way now. Even now, when someone is trying to say, or a Chinese nation is going to say, we're going to rise up, or America is going to rise up, or the UN are going to come together and we're going to rise up as a conglomerate of nations, it really doesn't matter. God says, I still rule. And you can set yourself up, but my plans will still be fulfilled, and I will still bring you down as much as you rise yourself up in pride and you set yourself in opposition against me. You ultimately will come up against me, and I will cut you down like a tree. And God still rules in the kingdom of men, even to this day. And so we're going to go into the book of Daniel, but there's just a brief overview. I didn't even get to to this section, but you probably already read it while I was talking anyway. But you'd be surprised how much of the Bible actually is contained in a relatively short amount of time. So the Judges, all of that 500 years or 470 years or however long it is, that's just one book in the Bible. And it covers a large amount. From after that, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, all of that is, again, another 500 or 600, 700 years. All of that is there. And then there's a whole period of 400 years of silence that goes all the way to Jesus comes. So there's large portions of silence, and the Bible covers this particular area. And then Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah fall in that particular part of it, of the timeline. And we'll bring out the timeline a few other times throughout the series and put things where they go. All right, find a prayer partner or two.